Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. For the second consecutive year, CSS has conducted a survey to understand the degree of economic hardship being felt by low-income New Yorkers. 1,000 New York City residents were polled this fall, and the results confirm that life is not getting any easier for the poor within our communities. Joining me now is Dee Brown, Senior Analyst with Lake Snell, Perry & Associates, the national research firm that conducted the survey for CSS. Dee, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
What is Lake Snell, Perry?
We are a national polling research firm. We also do focus groups as well as surveys. We are focused on progressive issues and electing progressive candidates.
Right.
And when we're not deeply steeped in politics, we're very much concerned about all of the issues of the day, everything from choice to income security, which is what's here now.
Is there often very much a focus on poor people and their interests and concerns? In other words, are they polled very often?
We've done more lately than we have in the past.
Right.
There's not a lot, although they're included in the general public, there has not been a lot of focus on finding out what low-income people actually think about.
What do you think that's all about? Why not?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they vote in lesser numbers. And I think a lot of polls are driven by looking at what likely voters are doing. And I think it's also because other reasons why people poll is because they want to know what consumers want to do, and they have less disposable income. So that might be another reason why they're not being polled as much as others.
But it certainly allows people to have all sorts of preconceptions about what the poor think and don't.
Yes, generally, because when people talk about the poor a lot, they talk about it from a policy perspective, and it's generally people who are saying, who may come in contact with the poor, but not actually the poor themselves, that are saying what they need and what they're thinking.
I'm wondering, is 1,000 people a representative poll? Is that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've done polls with less, and the margin of error determines the amount.
What is the margin? I don't think our
Okay,
audience...
so like, in other words, if you do 1,000 people in a poll, you may have or like we did with CSS, which was 750 low-income New Yorkers, the margin of error was plus or minus 3.5%. What that means is if I tell you that 50% think something, that means it could be either 47 or 46.5 or 53.
That's clear.
So anywhere in that margin could be that correct answer.
Before we get into the substance of these results, people are willing to talk about some of the things we asked about in this poll are fairly, did you lose your apartment? Did you, not take get medicine? Are people willing to talk that honestly?
Yes, they are actually, because when a poll begins, the initial questions are not as sensitive as some of the questions that you're referring to right now. So you kind of get them hooked. Because a lot of people have heard about polls, they see the polls on the news every day, and they always say to themselves, well who are these people? I've never been called. Well, when they get called, they tend to answer. Well,
let's talk about the specifics. What sort of struck you out of this survey that was, you think, significant from your background and work here?
Okay, well, I wasn't surprised that the economic issues dominated.
And what would they indicate?
People think that the biggest problems facing New York, as well as their personal concerns, are jobs, the economy, affordable housing. These are issues that are very much uppermost in their minds, and they want something done about them.
And as they describe their kinds of hardships, what would they describe? What was happening with their lives?
They have a number of hardships. They're concerned about having their wages and tips reduced, having to postpone medical treatment, not being able to fulfill prescriptions, having to cut back on school supplies for their children.
They were reporting they had to do this.
Yes. About 60% of poor, and that means up to 100% of poverty, reported that they had at least two of the hardships.
So it means you couldn't go to a doctor.
You couldn't go to a doctor, couldn't fill a prescription. Couldn't buy your kid clothes for school or books, and that includes like books, loose leaf paper and other supplies that they may need. May not be able to pay rent, may have had to move in with a relative because they couldn't pay rent.
And were these people earning livings? I mean, when they reported, are these...
Absolutely. The figure that I gave you for 60%, actually 67% had two or more hardship,
Right.
were working poor. They worked full-time.
So this isn't the stereotype of the welfare,
No.
even though people who are just lazing around.
Absolutely not. These people wake up every morning, go to work,
Right.
And work 40 hours a week. And they come home and they still can't quite make it.
And what would they like government to do about it? As you polled them, I know this came out.
Well, we asked them certain questions. They would like some help in keeping rents down or building more affordable housing. That's one of the things they'd like. But one of the major things, and this is across all income groups, regardless of what they made at home, they think one of the best ways to help them move ahead is about skills acquisition, job training, vocational higher education, basic education. These are the things that people really think they need in order to be able to get ahead.
Are they blaming anyone for their problems now, politically?
Well, they, in a large part, I'd say about 2/3 say that the recent transit fare hikes and the sales tax has made it much harder for them to make ends meet. Yeah. And I think that those numbers were kind of astronomical. I think it was something in the 80% range said harder, and about 67% said much harder. So I think that's
now the
problem.
preconception is, and actually we referred to it as we started this program, that, well, you know, politicians don't have to be worried about this group, they don't vote. Was that what was coming through? Are these guys willing to participate in the political process?
Well, now here's the thing. They said, a large numbers of them said that they were registered and also said that they voted. But we know this is just not low-income groups. These are everyone across the board. People tend to know they should vote.
Right.
So
It's
when
like
you
motherhood.
ask them the questions, that
Yes.
number tends to be inflated somewhat. But this would be the time for groups that were focused on getting people out to vote to focus on this population.
Now, we did something in this poll not only to look at very low-income people, but also at people of moderate and higher income.
Absolutely.
And how many people were involved in that part of the?
We looked at about 250 people who had moderate to higher income.
Just to get a sense of how it looked.
Yes, and also so that we would be able to combine all of the income groups and to weight them in a way in which we could see New York City as a whole and be able to compare how different these groups were. And what we found was in many of the areas, they're not all that different.
Like what? What comes to mind as you think about it?
Well, for instance, they all pretty much think that jobs and education and training is the way to go.
So a middle-class person thinks that's the way
Absolutely.
to do it as
Higher
well.
income thinks that's the way, lower income thinks that's the way. But they also think that New York City's public schools do not prepare kids to get a decent job, and that's across the board. And we're talking, anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 who think that New York City schools do not get the job
So that's
done.
people at or below the poverty line?
Below poverty,
and
above poverty.
They get it.
They all get that. And they think that that school funding should be increased. This is across the board. And you would expect that people would say, yes, I'm all for increased funding for school. But they also say it, David, even if it means higher taxes.
They're willing to pay.
They are willing to pay higher taxes. Oh, sure, there are some that are tax sensitive, and the numbers drop slightly in those most, in some of those categories. But still, a majority strongly favor increasing school funding, even if it means higher taxes.
Did they talk anything about the unemployed or people on welfare or how they were feeling about that?
We didn't ask them a lot of questions about that per se, but what we do know from the survey is that working every day doesn't really mean that you don't suffer these hardships. What we found was that about 44%, that's nearly half, of poor New Yorkers who are working full time don't have health insurance offered to them by their employer. Somewhere like from 60 to 65% don't have paid vacations, paid sick leave, retirement, or
even
health
the
care for their
issue of
families.
paid sick leave, this is ridiculous. You're not allowed to get sick, in other words. That
Exactly.
means you lose a day's pay if you're sick.
Exactly.
That's a throwback before Roosevelt.
Absolutely.
That was a New Deal, part of it.
So these people are, they're working every day, and part of welfare reform was to say, well, these people need to work. Well, if they need to work, then I think maybe we ought to think about some of the other things that other workers expect being afforded with this particular group.
My thanks to Dee Brown, Senior Analyst with Lake Snell Perry and Associates, the national research firm. We'll be right back to continue the Urban Agenda.
Are your kids getting enough art? Whether through poetry, dance, music, or drama, the arts open the doors to creativity. As a mother and teacher, I know that arts education can help our children develop confidence and a better understanding of the world around them. Even if you have just 30 minutes a week, get your kids more involved in the arts and think about the kind of world we can leave behind for our children and our children's children.
Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
We're discussing the results of CSS's annual survey of low-income New Yorkers. Joining me now are two colleagues from not-for-profit organizations that have worked closely with CSS. Dr. Nicole Hollingsworth is Deputy Director of the Northern Manhattan Perinatal Partnership, and Robert Carmona, co-founder and president of Scribe National, which began as Scribe East Harlem Employment Service. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Starting with you, Rob, tell us about Strive. I know more, but
Okay.
I don't think a lot of people know about it. It's incredible.
Okay, Strive is, by definition, an employment training and placement organization. And I was just speaking to our colleagues out there. I've come to realize over the years that it's really an individual empowerment program that uses employment as the vehicle to get people to take control of their lives. And we started in the basement in the community center in East Harlem, and now has 34 sites in 20 cities, as well as overseas in London, Puerto Rico, and what have you. We're very proud of the organization's accomplishments.
And Nicole, describe the Perinatal Network.
Well, the Perinatal Network, so-called because we take care of a woman and her family from the moment she discovers she's pregnant through the child's first year of life, really works to ensure that that child survives through that first year and that the family has what it needs to really build and become healthy over that time.
Well, we have a survey out that actually talks to both of your issues. I mean, one of the things, Rob, for instance, that came out like a shot with all income levels, they think the best way out of poverty is training and employment skills for people who are having difficulty. And how does this fit with your program?
It's dead on. What we've learned over the years is it's a two-step process. That our first training is more attitudinal in nature, focuses on the soft skills, what have you, Dave. And the individual is then placed in entry-level jobs. Once they've done that 3 to 6 months, then we look at wage growth opportunities. We have a secondary program called Career Path, which helps to impart skills. We have a Cisco Academy, Brownfield training, all different kind of trainings, all geared to wage growth. And that's relatively recent in the last several years. We naively believed, I don't know why we believed this, that if you work long enough, you stop being poor. Well, that flies in the face of my own experience growing up, and you need an active intervention for these individuals to get them to the next level.
Describe an individual who comes to the program. What would they?
Typical, well, probably 2/3 women, right? A lot of
Really?
them, yeah, 2/3 women. A lot of them coming off of public assistance or coming out of abused relationships, that kind of thing, and they're recently divorced or what have you. The other third, men, primarily ex-offenders, that really want to turn their lives around. They're tired of looking over their shoulder and what have you. And they come with a hunger, actually. They come and ostensibly they say, we want jobs. But there are a lot of other issues behind that, Dave, that they need help with. Housing, medical benefits, all the kind of wraparound stuff that people don't necessarily relate to what a person needs, not only to get a job, but to keep a job.
Well, this is actually segues well. I mean, one of the things that the survey finds that people are not getting adequate health care, and they're giving up on that quick, and they have no paid vacations to spend any time with kids. How does this work when you see people coming into your program?
Well, in our particular program, we try to really work around the entire family's needs. So if someone comes in and they're not accessing health care, that's the first thing that we try to do. We have a number of relationships that allow us expedited care. So we can get someone into care within 24 hours, where on their own they would necessarily have to wait a week to 2 weeks for an appointment. But with regard to all of the other issues, for us, it's more about keeping that family in care. Because with prenatal, it's not just one appointment, it's every appointment. It's going to, social services and making sure you have those things you need. It's having someone sit with you as you're waiting in EAU to end up in a shelter so that you don't just walk away.
EAU is
the Emergency Assistance
Unit,
which for people, we deal primarily in the northern Manhattan region. The EAU unit is in the South Bronx at 161st Street. It's commuting there with 3 kids.
That's
you have no
ridiculous.
money, you have no housing, you may be there all day, possibly all night. They may put you in a housing situation and then tell you, okay, tomorrow you're going to need to be in Brooklyn, you're going to need to be in Manhattan, you're going to need to be in the Bronx. And with all of that movement, getting consistent care is quite a challenge.
Now, Rob, I mean, part of the deal here is trying to convince, powers that be, government, and the general public that, the image they have of people who are either unemployed or on welfare is that they just hanging around. This is just the greatest thing since sliced bread. They're not looking actively for jobs. How has it been in terms of turning this around, in terms of your support and the public perception that Scribe brings to the table?
Clearly in this climate, fiscal climate, has been tougher. I mean, the irony of this kind of stuff, Dave, is that for all of us represented at this table, our programs are always relevant, but we become even more relevant in the harder times, and we become more relevant at the same time that resources are dwindling to work with the pain and challenges that our clientele face. What we have had to do is actually put on 2 and 3 hats, and everything that we do is focused from the client on the betterment of the client, if you may. If that entails us working till 9 o'clock that night to kind of square them away, or on Saturdays or what have you, that's what we have to do. And I'm glad that I have such a committed, passionate colleagues at Strive that will go that extra mile because they feel that that's what they have to do because it's been done for them.
And is there sufficient revenue to do this kind of work?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be disingenuous, but
it has not trickled down. Let me put it like it has
down.
not trickled down. In fact, there are some contracts that we have been, and I was just telling my colleague about this, that we've been successful at that have been cut in half in the middle of the contract. The revenue acquisition is tough, both private and public.
And what about the private sector? Are they willing to take the people you train and retool?
Yeah, but more on the entry-level side. One of the things we're finding is because Strive provides each client with a lifetime commitment of service,
Right.
we now have clients that graduated and were placed 10 years ago coming back saying, hey, help me out, I got downsized.
Now, what about our friends in the union movement? Any help?
No, actually, they're struggling too.
Yeah.
In fact, one of our a colleague agency that was backed by a number of unions is going through some very, very tough times. This is not the political season for unions, I think.
Right. Well, let's talk about healthcare and the revenue stream, obviously. I don't know how many immigrant families you have to deal with. Where is the money, obviously? This is all a cost. Can you make sure that all your clients have the actual fee, money to pay for this stuff?
Well, for us, it's in 2 parts. For individuals that are pregnant, New York State is one of the only states that actually guarantees them care. So while someone is pregnant, it's great. You can get them into care, they can be seen. But 6 weeks after they deliver, any identified health care conditions that may have existed are sort of left up in the dust. And if they're not a citizen and they're not eligible for any programming, there's very little that we can do.
This was one of the benefits
Right.
we got from the conservative Congress that decided that no benefits for even legal immigrants who are paying taxes
Right.
and doing all the rest, which comprise enormous numbers of our constituents, can get benefits.
6 weeks postpartum for women, there's nothing if they're not citizens, if they're not a citizen. For their family members, there's nothing. Right now, there's a very limited relationship through the Health and Hospitals Corporation that will sort of do a fee scaling for them through a program they have called HHC Plus, where if you tie yourself to one public hospital, they'll allow you to come in for $15 visits, and that'll essentially cover everything. That's a plus, but it's not everything. We've got families that can't afford
Can't afford the
$15.
$15.
In the meantime, we're providing everything from diapers. I mean, you're talking about health care, but if someone can't get diapers for their baby on a regular basis, they're not going to go and make those types of visits. And now in Harlem, we've got all of these cuts that are happening. New York Presbyterian excuse me, is doing a number of cuts. There's a protest scheduled for later on this month where, you know, they're closing 2 clinics in public housing. And when you look at what, you know, who's going to those clinics, those are the neediest families. Those are, in some cases, you know, immigrant families taking their kids there, and that's being closed.
And what New York Presbyterians say, there's no revenue.
They're saying it's no revenue.
Well,
But then that also affects Harlem Hospital
Sure.
as well as.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm on the State Senate's Medicaid task force, and I've been horrified listening to some of the discussions. The state Senate is getting ready to make a proposal to cut back on Medicaid. And some of the proposals, everyone admits that the big engine of expense is with long-term care and the elderly, which we have to be concerned about as well, and people who are handicapped. But whenever they talk about it, where they're going to cut, there are too many people being let into the program, i.e., you know, too many immigrants, the rest. And it's one thing that concerns me when I sometimes talk to my representative of the city, that they start to flip on this as well, talking about people creeping into New York for the Medicaid benefit. There's some real bizarre notions that still lie in people's consciousness about what's really the problem here. And you keep coming up against it as you go. And this is
one thing you need to take back to them is that for a child born at a very low birth weight, it costs $185,000 to care for that child through its first year of life. There are a number of programs that don't have annual funding that go out and serve the public for what it costs to prevent one very low birth weight. You've got to protect the kids. We're living in neighborhoods where infant mortality was at one point rivaling, you know, third world countries. We throw resources in, those numbers start to come down because we're finally providing the services that they need, and then all of a sudden we pull back the money and we go, no, it's not there anymore. And the numbers bounce around, so you'll get a 10.1 rate one year, 6.2 the next, and without any support, it'll go right back up to the 27.7 it was 10 years ago.
Right. Just to make a comment, you know, and this is apropos of what this show was premised on when CSS did the study. The results of that study, quite frankly, are very consistent with what came out in the Times several weeks ago. That I think it's 1 out of every 7 Americans now not covered by health care, poor getting poorer, and all that kind of stuff. And what is frightening to me, I mean, and I'm using the word frightening kindly because I have such a passion and yes, an anger about what I see, and I don't even see legislators even looking out for their own self-interest. Just a quick anecdote, when we were starting Strive in Boston, the chair is a very well-heeled senior partner in one of the biggest real estate law firms in Boston. And when we were making a pitch to a number of foundations, this gentleman actually put his head down and was very emotional for about 30 seconds, which is a long time, and he had all the foundations mesmerized. And when he brought his head up, he lives in a suburb of Boston called Wellesley, which is similar to Scarsdale. And what he said was, I have to do this work because my 2 sons, right, I have to accept that however goes inner city Boston goes Wellesley, and I cannot build a fortress around Wellesley to protect my sons. And I'm not sure that people who develop policy boil it down to the kid that they see in their living room. And they have to start doing that.
Well, the racial divide allowed this to happen. I mean, that's, you know, and they played this, the conservatives played us to fairly well, cutting back benefits basically for white and black and brown, but using sort of the racial problems of the nation as the excuse or predicate for this damn stuff, and they've worked it out. I mean, the working poor, as we start to look at it, across the racial divide, but if you ask somebody, about welfare, those are those people who are sitting around that we see on television. And it's been a very pernicious kind of stuff. And you see it, when we did the 9/11 work after dealing with displaced workers, these guys would come in. I mean, I couldn't work this many hours. I had a 78-year-old messenger who was living in an SRO who had never gotten anything. Incredible hard work and willingness, everything you wanted from the American dream, and they had messed with him badly.
The other thing too, if I may, the other thing that amazes me when we're talking about these working poor people trying to struggle, get their lives together, what I see every day is the amazing strength that they have. I lived the client experience so many years ago that it's almost conceptual for me at this point. But when they come in and I hear these single parent women or guys that are trying to get their lives together, reconnect with their children, and they just want to work and provide, for the emotional, financial sustenance of their kids. And when they begin to articulate the challenges they face on a daily basis, I have to tell you, I am absolutely in awe. I sit back and say, wow, and you actually got out of bed this morning?
That's right.
We have a client who actually ended up becoming an employee who was just like that. Amazing woman, but literally had her children in Brooklyn, was coming to volunteer at the agency in Manhattan, was still dealing with emergency housing, emergency care, ended up having a premature infant in the midst of all of this, still was coming to work. An amazing
incredible
setup, and it
Well,
finally worked out.
We've sort of run out of time, but I really wanted to thank you, Pat, both. My thanks to both our guests. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society, and thank you for watching The Urban Agenda. To learn more about the work of the Community Service Society of New York or to comment on the Urban Agenda, please contact us at 212-614-5425 and on the web at www.cssny.org.